Hello, good evening. Okay, goodness. Okay, now I can hear. Okay, my name is Rahima Barber. I'm the Director of Curatorial Affairs, and I am so delighted and pleased to greet you all this evening. And I just have to say, on a personal note, James and I, Dr. Denison, and some of you may know him. Um, I was just talking about, like, wow, this is such a bittersweet moment because this is one of our last talks that we're going to get from him. But what I want you to know is that you are truly in for a real treat. James is an exceptional scholar. And it's been my pleasure and honor to work with him over the last 3 years. Um, and I know that Kay College, who has been a tremendous partner for this postdoc fellow, is really also knowing how an amazing professor and teacher he has been. So I hope you enjoy this evening tonight. But I have to do a little bit of housekeeping and introduce him properly. And I will say, before he gets up here, if you have any cell phones or things like that, please make sure your ringers are off. But let me introduce you to Dr. Denison. James Denison is a native of Washington, D.C. area and a graduate of Bowdoin College. He completed his PhD in art history at the University of Michigan in 2023. Go Blue. While at Michigan, he wrote a dissertation on the connections between the group of American modernists known as the Stieglitz Circle and racism in the interwar U.S. And in the time since, he has published scholarly writing in the journals Word and Image, Panorama, and CAA Reviews. And this summer, Dr. Denison will have a review of the exhibition of Tiwa Nage, Tiwa County, currently on view through November 1st, 2026, which is at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum, and that will be in the Art Journal. So be on the lookout for that. He also has published in our collections handbook. So if you haven't seen it, please make sure you do. He's done an excellent job in that. And you can also read his writing downstairs too on many of our labels. Since 2023, he has worked at the Kalamazoo Institute of Arts and Kay College as the Postdoctoral Curatorial Fellow and a visiting assistant professor of art history. At the KIA, some of his main projects have included the KIA Centennial Exhibition, Legendary Voices, Art for the Next Century, of course, the museum catalog that I just mentioned, 101 legendary selections from the KIA. He also is being very modest and has contributed to another publication that was on art, music, and feminism in the 1950s. He wrote a really amazing article for that. And so we have kept him super busy, as has Kay College. He has been quite the addition here. At Kay College, he has taught a variety of courses on modern art and visual culture. And currently, Dr. Denison is teaching an American Art Survey course and a photography and colonialism course, both of which meet weekly here at the KIA. And on the last note, if you didn't know, he's our very own Jeopardy winner. He won it here a couple of weeks. Wow, no, not a couple of weeks, but like a month and a half here. And we were just so thrilled and so excited for him because we know he has an exceptional mind and a big, big brain of all kinds of facts. And we love that. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming him very heartily up to this podium and for Dr. James Denison.
Awesome. Thank you. That was such a kind introduction. Thank you, Rahima. And before I get started, I just want to say thank you all for being here. And thanks to Kay and the KIA for co-sponsoring me and this talk. And also, I want to thank Miriam Thomas for helping organizing this event. So thank you all. Here's my title slide. So the interpretation of Edward Hopper's art has often centered upon a few fundamental themes. One art historian has described Hopper's canvases as pensive inflections of life that reveal people isolated in stark rooms, portraits of aloneness, absorbed in themselves, detached from their world. In 1950, one of his earliest champions, the art historian Lloyd Goodrich, wrote that his pictures, quote, give a penetrating feeling of the vast impersonality of the city, of the loneliness that can be experienced most intensely among millions, and convey a reserved emotional attitude. Hints of this perception were even discernible in earlier appraisals of the artist. In 1927, Goodrich praised Hopper for his painting's spareness and austerity. In the decades since, although in other respects conceptions of the artist have changed, much of the discussion of his works continues to swirl around these same few ideas. Writing in 2002, art historian Erica Doss suggested his images pictured emotional alienation and the loneliness of modern life, the loss of community amidst modern capitalism's competitive self-interests. In 2009, Rebecca Zurier called him a poet of loneliness and an artist of human and urban consciousness whose images create vast spatial and psychological distances within the frame. Such descriptions suggest that Hopper's paintings are perceived to communicate a sense of solitude and emotional restraint, two characteristics that are often considered fundamental to the modern urban experience. Much of the writing about Hopper seeks to investigate and explain these themes. Some studies focus on the formal aspects of his art, often lingering on his use of empty space and shadow, while others read a sense of isolation in the faces and actions of his figures, and still others emphasize the generic anonymity of the settings that these figures inhabit. Indeed, explanations of the personal and sociocultural circumstances that may have led Hopper to paint such pictures and the visual strategies that he employed in order to evoke such a powerfully lonely vision of New York City life have so thoroughly dominated scholarship on Hopper that one might well wonder what else could possibly be said about this aspect of his work. However, one relatively unexplored aspect of Hopper's pictures that might, in shedding new light on the means by which they communicate a persistent sense of isolation, help us see them anew, is their portrayal of fashion. Throughout his career, but especially in the representations of city life that he produced in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, and those are the pictures that have subsequently come to make up the best-known segment of his work, Hopper shows a tendency to represent clothes that, although they don't seem out of step with the fashions of their time and place, are nonetheless simpler and less expressive than the real garments of his era, including the clothes he and his wife wore and those that he must have observed others wearing while living in New York City. This persistent tendency to simplify the clothes of the era has significant implications for the social messages that his images convey and how his pictures have been and continue to be interpreted by art historians. Perhaps most significantly, this tendency can help explain the long-standing identification of Hopper's art with psychological isolation and alienation in the modern urban world. Hopper had a significant interest in fashion and paid great attention to his attire. Photographs of the artist, young, old, and middle-aged, almost always show him meticulously dressed, typically in a tailored dark suit and tie and a white shirt, an outfit that he even wore when painting or sketching. This outfit, though of course ubiquitous among men of a certain class in the early 20th century, was also a key aspect of his self-image, as both his self-portraits and the outfits he chose for photographic portraits attest. In 1931, he responded to jokes about his conservative style by writing that, quote, I've just broken loose with a very brilliant black tie, unquote. He also paid a great deal of attention to the clothing choices of his wife and near constant companion, Jo, who was obsessed with her wardrobe. Jo shopped for clothes for both her and Edward, including the clothes she wore when she modeled for him, as she often did, and often did so at affordable stores like Woolworths and Sears, and frequently retailored and reused her own garments, habitually refusing to throw even a single piece of clothing out, no matter how old or worn. She sometimes complained that her husband was so fussy about anything I wear, likely because of his persistent attempts to control her dressing decisions and his habit of purchasing garments away from her when he disapproved of them. The importance of clothing to the pair's lives is evident when reading through Jo's diaries. On one hand, her frequent mention of clothes worn by both her and her husband seems like quite a normal aspect of the lives of a couple who often socialized as they moved back and forth between the Manhattan art world and a summer home on Cape Cod. While attention to clothes was a matter of practical concern, and the diaries often mentioned mundane worries like whether her or Edward's clothes were right for the weather, their social life also included parties, dinners, receptions, and other social events at which dressing appropriately was important, and deviation from established sartorial norms would normally provoke consternation and comment. Evidently, this was a point of concern for Edward too, as Jo insinuates when she writes about being, quote, afraid he was being made uncomfortable by me wearing old blue corduroy overalls and a big sun hat in a restaurant full of the town's people in festive summer Sunday clothes. That was while they were on a trip in 1941. But Jo's discussion of clothes often seems to go beyond what one might expect, including frequent mention of the clothes that she or her husband owned or wore. From 1937, quote, Miss Mielsener's chauffeur came to bring the message from Mrs. M, who's sitting in her car, to ask me to go to the Chickerset Golf Club to tea. I dashed about to find something to wear, Edward helping me. I hauled out that peasant frock with the low back that I haven't worn before, so I hadn't thought about the shoes or the hat, etc. It was a hot day, so I took out the old sun hat, and Edward liked the effect. And then the next year, trip to Sears Roebuck, Edward bought a policeman's raincoat. A few years later, Edward wearing his new brown corduroy coat and tweed hat. And there are a million examples of things like this. At one moment in a 1955 entry in which she expresses her resentment at her treatment by Edward, she laments that she had become almost defined and stripped of her individuality by her clothes and her role as the wife of this famous artist. He gets the Arts and Letters largest award, and I, the silly little victim there, in a good hat to clip and remember to report, to account for and explain. As her husband's frequent model, she also sometimes mentions his instructions about what she should wear when posing for certain pictures. From 1938, Eddie started a little canvas, had me pose for the figure by nightlight in a big pokey hat with my hair down. The next year, I posed for 2 figures in black hat with veil and fur coat, then a little brown cloth hat with gala feathers and a linen collar. This interest in, or even obsession with clothes, was evident from Hopper's earliest years as an artist, when he produced countless drawings and paintings of social attire and sartorial display. As a young man, Hopper imitated many of his fellow American artists by making several lengthy trips to Paris, which resulted in a series of watercolors depicting various character types from the Parisian streets. These images were called 19th century French drawings that sought to link the inner character of individuals to their outward appearance by grouping people into types based on their fashion choices and other aspects of their appearances. For example, Dandy seated at a cafe table on the left represents one of the best-known character types from 19th century Western Europe. Hopper's image of the dandy aptly captures the character's social pretensions and fastidious attention to the details of his personal appearance. From his oddly shaped hat to his striped socks and yellow boots, Hopper's dandy reveals not just the subject's attention to the particulars of the latest fashion trends, but also Hopper's. This attentiveness on the artist's part was not exclusive to his images of those who paid the greatest attention to their clothes, but also extended to less glamorous character types, including prostitutes, and we see his representation of a prostitute on the right. Hopper's biographer Gail Levin has suggested that, quote, Paris produced in him a kind of sexual awakening, and this led him to depict a wide variety of sexually available female character types in his sketches. In his watercolor of a female sex worker, we can glimpse some of the features that would come to characterize the artist's later representations of New York women. Hopper's image shows a statuesque woman posing provocatively in a form-fitting brown skirt, white blouse, and bronze heels. If Hopper did experience a sexual awakening in Paris, then evidently it manifested itself in a close attention to women's clothes. Hopper also demonstrated a focus on clothes in his commercial illustration practice, which sometimes pictured people in offices or about the town and included work for clothing companies and related businesses. He also, in the early 1920s, twice depicted women in apartments working at sewing machines. That one on the right is from the KIA's collection. Still, much like his earlier image of the fille de joie we were looking at on the last slide, the clothing represented in Hopper's scenes, city scenes of the 20s, 30s, and 40s, seems at first glance to be relatively unremarkable. Consider Hopper's most famous picture, Nighthawks, a work in which the artist himself said that he was, quote, painting the loneliness of a large city. Although the dark suits the men sport curiously resemble Hopper's own favorite attire, the clothes of the 4 figures otherwise appear relatively nondescript, and their simplicity is hinted at in a description of the picture written by Joe Hopper soon after Edward painted it. This description says almost nothing of the diner or the street, instead focusing almost exclusively on the figures and especially their clothes. It reads, quote, very good-looking blonde boy in a white coat and cap inside the counter. Girl in red blouse, brown hair, eating sandwich. Man Nighthawk in dark suit, steel gray hat, black band, blue shirt, holding cigarette. Other figure dark, sinister back at the left, unquote. This description is not rich with detail, but then again, neither are the clothes in the picture that it describes. Both description and painting depict the clothes as relatively unremarkable, seemingly appropriate to the professional and social roles of the picture's protagonists. However, although the clothes in the painting seem relatively unexceptional, by effectively communicating the scene's social roles and relationships, they are fundamental to the mood of the image, whose thematization of urban loneliness helped it become the quintessential Hopper picture. All of Jo's descriptions of her husband's work were not as single-mindedly fashion-focused as her depiction of Nighthawks, yet when figures are present, their clothes are almost always described by her in detail. One might argue that Hopper's depictions of clothes resemble his representations of places. Both are more remarkable for their simplicity and genericness than anything else. As art historian Carol Troyan has suggested, Hopper's pictures are unforgettable images of unremarkable places. Unlike other artists of his day who reveled in the monumentality and energy of New York, Hopper never painted the city's landmarks or its tourist attractions. Hopper's representations of clothes seem to tell a similar tale. Even if they are not exactly unremarkable, they are, like the streets, stores, restaurants, and theaters they haunt, relatively quotidian, never out of place, but rarely worthy of the viewer's attention or the critic's mention. Such an argument is encouraged by the fact that although the dark suits and tight-fitting monochrome dresses that populate Hopper's canvases from the 1920s onward do bear a certain resemblance to fashions of their time, although this habit of representing clothing in this way endured even as fashion trends changed across the decades in which Hopper painted, these clothes only represent a limited portion of the fashion landscape of the era. This suggests that Hopper's depictions of clothing represented a significant intervention on his part. Although the suit was already extremely popular among upper and middle-class men well before the 1930s, it took on a new significance within the context of the Great Depression. Only the wealthy could afford to continue to wear multiple outfits over the course of the day, and what emerged in the place of the lavishness of the 1920s was an attitude of simplicity, seriousness, and utilitarianism. This resulted in the rise of the all-purpose dark suit and its frequent companion, the fedora. As one fashion historian writes of male attire in the 30s, quote, "The plain dark business suit represented well-dressed, straightforward city attire. Sturdy and practical, it became a standard item," unquote. Such suits were supposedly more masculine than their predecessors, sporting newly large, square shoulders and pointed lapels that emphasized powerful, athletic builds. These changes conformed to an ongoing trend toward increasingly masculine, V-shaped suit cuts that dated back to the late 19th century. Paintings like Nighthawks, Hotel Lobby, and another one I'll show in a minute, Office at Night, confirm Hopper's interest in depicting such suits. The simplified, monochrome suits worn in Hopper's paintings fail to reflect the diversity of the era's male clothing landscape. Although the gray, blue, brown, or black suit remained standard throughout the 1930s and 40s, the era also bore witness to a rise in popularity of, striped and plaid suits, as well as colorful, often patterned shirts. I think I should still be on this slide. Oops. According to fashion historian Fareed Shanoon, the striped suit, in fact, seemed to have graced at one time or another every single pair of male shoulders in the 1930s. Despite such suits' remarkable popularity, Hopper did not recognize the trend in his work or in his own wardrobe. As fashion historian John Harvey has indicated, the dark suit was, though supposedly less expressive than the plaid or striped suit, socially communicative nonetheless. The dark suit, and the black suit in particular, carried countless social meanings, foremost among them the seriousness of purpose and even quasi-asceticism that has long partially characterized the professional male attitude in modern capitalist society. By refusing to depict the new patterns in male dress that emerged in the 1930s, Hopper embraced the austere social meanings associated with the monochrome dark suit by default. A similar trend plays out across Hopper's representations of urban women's fashion, as he typically dressed women in simplified monochrome dresses. This pattern is reflective of the broader limitations of the repertoire of women's dresses in his paintings, which, though they are shown in a variety of colors, normally hug the body tightly and feature scoop and V-necks that highlight curvaceous figures. Consider, for example, the red and blue dresses featured in 1943's Hotel Lobby. These two garments would not have been completely out of step with 1930s or early 1940s women's fashion, yet they're also simpler than virtually anything women actually wore during the period, even in light of the simplifying pressures of the Depression and wartime rationing. The red dress may have a small opening at the top of the bodice, although this is hard to tell, but the blue dress features really no details. Though most were not, it was not uncommon for dresses to be only one color, as was the case with the black Bonwit-Teller evening dress from the late 1940s you see on the right. But unlike the monochrome dresses in Hotel Lobby, the Bonwit-Teller dress features complex draping and crimping and expressively arranged straps, offering the garment jaunty details missing from the dresses in Hopper's paintings, which seem more like shells of fabric than real items of clothing. Indeed, when seeking to compare Hopper's representations of women's fashion in the early to mid-20th century, one might expect to find that, as is the case with his depiction of men's suits, he had merely chosen to paint some of the simpler garments women wore during the era. However, when investigating women's clothes from the time, and including extant garments, fashion and department store magazines, street photographs, and advertisements from the era, it's nearly impossible to find contemporaneous clothes marketed towards women of any social class that are as lacking in ornament as Hopper's painted representations of dresses, skirts, and blouses are. And really, it seems doubtful that such clothes were actually produced on a wide scale in early to mid-20th century America at all. Interestingly, one of the few times when Hopper did depict women's clothing with a multicolor pattern, a blue and white garment in 1931's hotel room that you see on the chair in the background, it sits on a chair, unworn. Most 1930s and 1940s dresses were not one color, with many women instead opting for more ostentatious patterns. But these more ornate and colorful clothing options were suppressed in Hopper's visual record. High-end fashion magazines and garments that are still around today from the period attest to the regularity with which ostentatious patterns and accessories were marketed to upper-class women and the impossibility of finding real upper-class women's clothes from the era that are as simple as those represented in Hopper's paintings. Many garments were far from demure or simple, like a 1935 silk evening dress featuring polka dots and bows, or a 1942 belted silk dinner dress covered in purple flowers and green leaves, both of which were sold by Bergdorf Goodman, an upscale department store at which the women represented in a hotel lobby could certainly have shopped, and where Jo Hopper also references shopping in her diary. Even when one-colored dresses were produced, not only did they often feature complex patterns, but decoration and accessorizing was unavoidable, as the crimping, ruffles, bows, belts, hats, gloves, and jewelry in a Bonwit-Teller advertisement featured in a 1938 edition of Vogue attest. The most expressive bit of clothing worn in hotel lobby is arguably the older woman's black feathered hat, which also seems relatively demure when compared to some of the extravagant women's hats of its era. Everyday dresses worn by the era's middle-class women tell a similar tale. Consider, for example, a few images from 1930s issues of a pattern book marketed, perhaps tellingly, as Simplicity Pattern, which featured sewing patterns that allowed women of limited means to produce their own dresses at home. Like the high-fashion dresses of the 1930s, the dresses featured in Simplicity Pattern included both complexly patterned and single-color examples, and typically included ribbons, buttons, belts, and other bits of flair. Similarly, middle-class mail-order and department store retailers of the 1930s, like Sears and Roebuck, also failed to offer any dresses matching the simplicity of those featured in Hopper's works, and instead marketed a variety of affordable garments featuring pleats, belts, patterns, and more. Street photographs from the era, like the one on the right, show complex patterns and accessories as well. Therefore, Hopper's consistent representation of unadorned, single-color women's clothes defies not just the diversity of the high-end fashion of the 1930s and 40s, but also its diversity across all socioeconomic levels. The simplicity of Hopper's skirts, dresses, and blouses is therefore not just remarkable within the wealthier context of hotel lobby or room in New York, but also in nighthawks and other representations of the urban middle class. And this resulted in a picture world in which women, like their male counterparts, seemed trapped by a sense of reticence and restraint. Indeed, the effect is perhaps even more marked given that there is a wider disparity between the expressiveness of actual women's fashions from the 30s and 40s and the painted garments in Hopper's paintings. Hopper's decision to depict simplified garments in his paintings is therefore no mere reflection of the fashion landscape of his time, but rather a significant mediation on his part. However, it's worth considering what this discrepancy really means, especially given the long history of visual artists representing clothes in simplified ways, whether out of ineptitude, laziness, inattention, or as part of some concerted effort to communicate meaning or implement a grander simplifying scheme. Hopper's work might well fall into this last category. Certainly, it demonstrates significant simplifying tendencies in other respects, including through its representation of unusually empty and clean places and its erasure of various other complexities and textures. His paintings do not closely resemble the real world that they supposedly depict, or maybe we should say to which they allude. And think about nighthawks. Might there not be people loitering or walking by, or cars zooming past in this metropolitan setting, even late at night? These questions could be dismissed as a matter of selection, but what seems impossible are the lack of cracks in the sidewalk, the lack of trash and grime in the street, the lack of peeling paint on the building facades, even the lack of tearing and wearing of the subject's clothes. The general lack of visual and physical imperfections in these perfectly dramatic scenes of perfect places where the psychological imperfections of modern living make themselves plain. Are Hopper's representations of simplified clothes, then, just a byproduct of some broader simplifying scheme, the result of his co-opting of an artistic tactic exemplified by countless artists dating back thousands of years, though used by Hopper to his own ends. Given Hopper's interest in dress, it seems improbable, though possible, that he did not think much about the implications of reductive representations of contemporary clothing. Though I suspect that he was at least somewhat conscious of the effect that this had on his pictures and the messages that they send to their viewers, which I would argue was significant, this question remains largely unanswerable with the existing evidence. However, we might engage in a less speculative debate about how the lack of fashion detail in Harper's paintings has affected how the artist and his work have been perceived over the last century. After all, the implications of depicting generic clothing differ significantly from those of representing generic places. Whereas city streets and stores are the products of government infrastructure projects and the capitalist system, and thus are only representations of individual identities in a very abstract sense, since the late 19th century, theorists have suggested that clothing is fundamental to individual self-expression and social meaning-making in the modern urban world. The late 19th century sociologist Thorstein Veblen identified clothing as a fundamental part of the system of conspicuous consumption by which modern urban people express and identified class differences. As the new century wore on, during the period when Hopper represented urban living again and again in his work, following or defying prevailing tastes in fashion remained the primary way of expressing a public identity, whether aspirational, normative, or non-conformational. An influential argument about the communicatory function of clothing is made by English psychologist John Carl Flugel in his 1930 Psychology of Clothes. As Flugel writes, the very word personality implies a mask, which is itself an article of clothing. Clothes have entered into the very core of our existence as social beings. 21st century fashion theorist Joanne Entwistle describes dress as both a social and a personal experience, and a fundamental aspect of social order. But the function of clothes is not only to signal conformity to social norms that demand or at least suggest we dress ourselves in certain ways under certain circumstances. It is also, perhaps particularly within modern society, fundamental to how we express ourselves. According to sociologist Fred Davis, clothing acquires a special capacity to say things about the self, and comes easily to serve as a kind of visual metaphor for identity. But if clothes are intended to convey personal identity, then what does Hopper's decision to paint his figures in generic clothing imply? Such a line of thought is encouraged by the psychological nature of Hopper's visual investigations of urban life. After all, if there is one grand modern idea that Hopper's pictures have been said to invoke, it's the immense solitude of being surrounded by people, the vast impersonality of the city that one critic mentioned. When asked to explain what he hoped to communicate through his work, Hopper himself stated that it was a synthesis of my inner experience, and that so much of every art is an expression of the subconscious that it seems to me most of all the important qualities are put there unconsciously, and a little of importance by the conscious intellect. These are things for the psychologist to untangle, unquote. In another statement, he said that great art is the outward expression of the inner life of the artist, and this inner life will result in his personal vision of the world. Given this emphasis on psychology, what might it mean that Hopper's figures' clothes seem at first glance to say so little? I would argue that these figures' seemingly unremarkable attire provides them with a sense of both fashionability and conformity, a relatively stylish non-individuality. In implying a normative mode of participation in society without any individualized sense of self-expressiveness, Hopper's figures' clothes identify their wearers as the victims of the isolating, often dehumanizing conditions of modern urban living. The idea that Hopper's paintings communicate the solitude and impersonality of city life is a resonant one in part because it conforms to grander narratives about the alienating and lonely nature of the modern urban experience. Sociologist Georg Simmel suggested that in the metropolis is to be found such an overwhelming fullness of crystallized and impersonalized spirit that the personality cannot maintain itself under its impact. Simmel saw bodily endowment as the most fundamental expression of the human personality that the urban environment supposedly inhibited, writing that every property is the extension of the personality. This expression occurs most completely in regard to our body, which thus is our first and most unconditional possession. In the adorned body, we possess more. If human expression was to be fully realized by the adornment of the body, and the metropolis was the arena in which personal life was most thoroughly suppressed, might not the ultimate expression of the psychological experience of urban life be the non-adornment of the human body? Hopper's representations of clothes are striking in part because instead of highlighting their wearers' individuality, they signal their conformity to social norms, in large part through their garments' simplicity and lack of adornment. Given that many of Hopper's depictions of clothes were too simple to be representative of the actual fashion landscape of their era, we can imagine his urban figures as allegories of the psychological effects of living in an environment in which personal distinctiveness is denied. Nowhere did fashion norms have more significant implications than within the workplace. The notion that conservative normative dress was essential to social and professional acceptance in the 1930s was driven home by the popularity of so-called job manuals written for women seeking advice on professional fashion decorum. Art historian Ellen Wiley Todd has described the influence of manuals like Manners in Business and She Strives to Conquer on women's professional dress during the period. Women were often hired into office settings based less on competence than quote-unquote prettiness, a criterion that depended more on good grooming than on glamour or sex appeal. And authors, like those who wrote those manuals I mentioned, taught women how to walk the fine line between alluringness and professionalism through their choice of clothing. Transgressing such norms not only jeopardized one's chances of keeping or getting a job, but also caused one to risk being misidentified as a lower-class shop girl rather than a well-bred office girl. The well-groomed secretary was thus viewed not only as a cog in the office's machine, but also as a means of decorating the office environment itself. While Simmel suggested that a major avenue of modern self-expression was through bodily adornment, in 1930s office culture, bodies often became ornaments. Sociologist Ruth Rubenstein has outlined the psychological and behavioral impact of dressing to meet professional expectations often had on real-life early to mid-20th century Americans. She describes a study from the 1930s about the experience of a young man who, upon wearing a coat and tie to a series of job interviews, found that he said things that didn't reflect his individual concerns and interests. His responses at interviews were tailored to meet the social expectations that he get a job regardless of where it was and what he was expected to do. This anecdote suggests that a jacket, shirt, and tie represent a public self that has incorporated the societal expectation of self-restraint. This notion of self-restraint plays out powerfully in Hopper's pictures. Consider Office at Night from 1940, a painting that suggests the difficulties that working women encountered when trying to position themselves socially and professionally in office environments in the 30s and 40s. One scholar suggested that in this painting, the theme of restraint is reflected in part through the female figure's clothes. The scene seems fraught with the possibility of a sexual relationship. And art historian Ellen Wiley Todd suggests that it is the woman's outfit and pose that in large part give the viewer such an impression. Quote, "She controls the office decor with her beauty and her simple attire, a plain blue dress with a white collar. But her dress clings to her body. With her pose and her dramatic black hair and makeup, she oversteps the boundaries of charm to overtly sexual behavior, which the fair-haired male checks by not meeting her gaze." Unquote. In this case, according to Todd, the attire of the two figures both helps to create a tense situation within the picture and to resolve it. Although the woman's dress is tight, it is not in and of itself inappropriately provocative, and the man's neat suit and tie and awkward pose, though very common, nonetheless signal his adherence to the decorum of the office and his role as her corporate superior. At the same time, one might argue that Office at Night represents shifts in fashion and feminine behavior during a decade in which the, quote, overtly political work of first-wave feminism was diluted by economic struggles and consumer aspirations, but the significance of popular fashion as an aspect of women's negotiation of modernity and post-traditional identity grew. So this was an era in which women's roles within the workplace was changing. Todd had noted that the picture encapsulates the contradictions in popular advice literature marketed towards the new professional women during the era, in which women were asked to be simultaneously assertive and deferential, sexual and demure, leading to ambiguous power and gender relations like those visualized in Hopper's picture. Another art historian, Vivian Greed-Fried, has suggested that this and other pictures for which Jo Hopper, Edward's wife, served as a model were articulations of the Hopper's own sexual relationship, and that the interplay between artist and model even sometimes served as a battleground for the two as they fought for control in that relationship, a situation that was likely precipitated by its own set of ambiguous power and gender relations between the two. Tellingly, Jo's account of posing for the painting suggests an intended sexual theme for the picture. Quote, here's what she had to say. "It's a business office with older man at his desk and secretary, female fishing in a filing cabinet. I'm to pose for the same tonight in a light skirt, short to show the legs. Nice that I have good legs and some nice stockings." Although the picture's effect relies in part on its ambiguity about the roles and intentions of the two figures and its failure to provide a clear conclusion to the drama it portrays, the moment pictured is one of desire restrained. Although the woman has, perhaps intentionally, introduced an element of wistful longing into the lonely office, the man's eyes, pose, and clothes suggest that he will not indulge such a desire. In a way, the notion of the denial of a possible connection between two people is fundamental to the phenomenon of urban psychological isolation upon which Hopper's pictures dwell. Office at Night, like many of Hopper's paintings, thematizes the cruel irony of urban living, namely that it is when most surrounded by vast numbers of people that we can feel most alone. Thousands, even millions of connections, whether sexual or platonic, are possible, and yet it is often a sense of decorum, powerfully signaled in Hopper's pictures by his characters' uniformly normative clothes, that propels our restraint from pursuing such relationships. As Doss has written, Erica Doss, our historian, has written, Hopper's pictures reflect upon the standards of appearance, collegiality, etiquette, and propriety in the workplace that help shape a modern culture of emotional self-restraint and social policing. Like many of today's denizens of New York City, a sense of restraint leaves the men and women who populate Hopper's urban paintings isolated and anonymous within the crowd, surrounded by water with none to drink. Hopper's representations of men's and women's clothes suggest a capacity for self-expression that is consistent with the fashion norms for each gender during his era. Although both the men and the women of Hopper's pictures are typically garbed in simplified single-color garments, men only wear blue, black, gray, or brown suits, while women wear dresses, skirts, and blouses in a variety of somewhat less drab colors. For example, the bright red orange of the dress of the woman in Room in New York. Although some might argue that dressing women in brighter colors suggests they have a greater capacity for personal fashion expression than do men in Hopper's pictures, such differences were virtually unavoidable. Hopper wanted his representations to convincingly resemble, if not fully mimic, real clothes of the period. As both high and middle class women's clothes of the era suggest, women would only rarely have dressed in colors as staid or boring as those used for men's suits. And one can imagine that only representing women dressed in blue, black, gray, or brown, like, for example, the woman in Conference at Night on the right, might have resonated as rather odd. Meanwhile, though the 1930s saw the men's fashion world more fully accept bright colors and daring patterns and become an arena in which, selecting proper colors among many was an important concern, hardly any fashion observer could have disagreed with what one newspaper editor called said in 1931 that certainly men's clothes are not so gay as women's, nor are they so obvious. These long-standing differences between men's and women's attire have been heavily theorized. One scholar argues that the womanliness of women's apparel resolves itself into the more effective hindrance to useful exertion offered by the garments peculiar to women. It's just to say that women's clothes tend to be inherently less practical. Another scholar states the point more directly. Insofar as dark menswear signifies the world of work and professional dignity, the brightness of women's clothes is not hard to understand. Most jobs were closed to women. Even women's garments intended for professional settings were, and typically still are, inherently more ornamental and less practical for non-social utilitarian purposes than men's. Though Hopper clothes his women in more expressive and socially and sexually oriented garments than his men, any other choice might have seemed bizarre. Hopper's more liberal use of color when representing women's clothes was also part of a broader economical simplifying painting style that typified his picture making. His stylized vision of the world segregates colors into discrete areas of the canvas, or what one art historian called flat planes and blocks of shadow. Though figures could not truly be flat planes of color while remaining at all realistic, the bright garments that adorn Hopper's representations of women contribute to his visual experiments in juxtaposing vivid, often saturated fields of color. Reconsider, for example, the striking red dress, or possibly just a blouse, of the woman seated at the counter in Nighthawks. Although this garment serves the purpose of clothing its wearer, it also plays a significant role in the picture's network of color relationships. For example, the red of the woman's blouse provides a stark contrast with the pale yellow of the diner walls, as well as the dark tones of both the street behind her and the suit of her male companion. In fact, the blouse plays a significant role in the painting, in part because it is neither a particularly light nor a dark color, but rather lies in between the two in terms of both tint and hue, and thus is able to effectively bridge the gap between the bright interior of the diner and the dark space above and beyond the counter. This helps the viewer's eye move smoothly through the picture's different zones and comfortably establishes the blouse's wearer and her companion's positions within the picture's depth, which is slightly murky once one advances beyond the far side of the diner counter. And finally, the red blouse helps to anchor the viewer's visual experience of the picture by giving its composition a pleasing, controlled asymmetry, which helps lend the picture some of its mysterious by suggesting a narrative that consists of both presence and absence, and that is implied through the figure's objects and settings, but is never completed. Meaning and resolution are always lurking just beyond the edges of the canvas. Jo connects her husband's interest in the formal relationship in his paintings with his habit of constructing social barriers between their human protagonists in a diary entry. Quote, "He's a classicist whose love of order, measure, and proportion naturally connects with human beings and their disorderly behavior. When he places them in a picture, his dislike for them and their own for each other is immediately apparent, for not one of them ever has any contact with the other or any pleasure in the other's presence." Kind of a mean thing for a wife to say about her husband's pictures. Like most of Hopper's finished paintings, Nighthawks features figures that are artfully and dynamically arrayed, and by drawing our attention to the far vertex of the triangle formed by the woman and the solitary customer and the man behind the counter, the red blouse forces us to notice and engage with all four of the picture's figures. At the same time, this compositional scheme lends the right side of the picture a weight that reminds the viewer that they are looking at an uneven scene from a dynamic angle, a weight, a nearly omnipresent tactic in Hopper's late work. The significant role of color is a near constant presence in Hopper's urban paintings. A similar story might be told about the red dress of the older woman in Hotel Lobby, which immediately draws the viewer's eye because of its contrast with the blues that otherwise pervade the canvas, while also punctuating the far vertex of another compositional triangle. Similarly, the green, blue, and purple clothes of the women in Chop Suey, although they reveal a slightly earlier moment in fashion history, nonetheless provide a stark contrast with the orange and yellow hues of the restaurant's walls and the Chop Suey sign visible through the window, while also helping the viewer engage with an uneven dynamic composition. By suppressing ornament and rendering clothes in single, carefully chosen colors, Hopper shaped a world in which the practice of personal expression through fashion display is largely neutralized, while simultaneously affording himself the opportunity to experiment with new sets of color and compositional relationships. Even Hopper's seemingly most expressive garments, bright women's dresses, skirts, and blouses, were at least in part the byproducts of the artist's manipulation of color and pictorial space. Though Hopper maintained that, to me, form, color, and design are merely a means to an end, or the tools I work with, and that he was interested primarily in the vast field of experience and sensation with neither literature nor art deals with, his visual tactics played a fundamental role in the communication of these experiences and sensations, and therefore in his picture's successful reflection and communication of modern urban loneliness and alienation. This pattern of rendering women's clothes as rather flat blocks of color highlights the relationship between Hopper's work and film noir, which also reveled in flatness and shadow, and which was emerging as a popular genre in the United States in the late 30s and early 40s. The connection between Hopper and noir film is a well-drawn one. Hopper was an obsessive moviegoer and undertook commissions for movie stars, production companies, and film magazines. He even represented in a few of his works, like these two, including, the Sheridan Theater and New York Movie, and told another artist that, "When I don't feel in the mood for painting, I go to the movies for a week or more. I go on a regular movie binge." Hopper both influenced and was influenced by film noir. His paintings often resembled noir stills in part because of their persistent use of dramatic lighting, sparse settings, and relatively few figures, which on both canvas and film combined to sinister and mysterious effect. Meanwhile, Hopper's pictures also directly affected at least one major film noir called The Killers from 1946, which featured a set that was supposed to resemble the diner in Nighthawks. This was partially because Hopper's painting had been inspired in part by the Ernest Hemingway short story upon which the movie was based. Scholars have suggested that Hopper's affinity for an artistic process that prioritized imaginative reconstruction rather than close copying of the real world linked it to Hollywood films that similarly relied upon viewers' familiarity with stock characters and locations, and they've suggested that his focus on urban solitude mirrored the focus on similar themes in the modern city featured in films of the 1940s. Most relevantly, Hopper's representations of clothes echo representations of fashion in film noir. Like Hopper's paintings, noir filmmakers presented a fashion landscape of limited expressiveness. As one historian writes, quote, "At the core of much crime narrative is the problem of identification. Both villains and their pursuers trade on anonymity. Consequently, noirs tend to feature simple, often monochromatic garments that bear a significant resemblance to Hopper's images of clothing. If anything, noir clothes seem to be even less expressive than Hopper's painted clothes because they were only recorded in black and white, whereas Hopper's paintings sometimes featured vibrant colors. As one scholar has noted, in crime films, suits often operate to repress everything out of the man, back behind the defensible lines of the image and also of the tailoring, a characterization that suggests similarities in the ways in which Hopper and noir directors and costume designers communicated gender roles. The persistent use of the silhouette in noir cinematography highlights Hopper's employment of a similar technique. Hopper's figures may play important roles in a pictorial system of planes of color and blocks of shadow, but in so doing, they often resemble full-color silhouettes, floating like cutouts against an often indistinct background. This resemblance highlights the significance of bodily and sartorial shape to Hopper's aesthetic. In paintings like Office at Night and Nighthawks, among others, Hopper's figures' bodies are sexed and gendered by differences that are emphasized by their clothes and their contrast with the backgrounds behind them. The general trend towards more form-fitting clothes in the 1930s meant bodily shape was increasingly visible, and Hopper's silhouette-like representations of clothes as planes of color emphasized this trend. Whereas the primary purpose of clothes in the Western world was, for centuries, encouraging sexual modesty through the masking of male and female forms, the movement towards emphasizing bodily shape through clothes in the 30s signaled just the opposite. In this way, much like suits in crime films, Hopper's representations of clothes seem to encourage normative gender roles by echoing 30s fashions that emphasize bodily shape and sex and gender differences. Some art historians have remarked about Hopper's compositional tendencies. Each of his paintings can function like a movie still, a scene that is frozen in time or a fragment removed from a temporal narrative. As dramatically lit paintings like Office at Night or Conference at Night or even Nighthawks suggest, Hopper's paintings regularly allude to events that have occurred before or will occur after the scene being visualized, and therefore represent moments pregnant with narrative potential. This effect is heightened by these works' sheer mysteriousness. The relative lack of information presented about the human dramas evoked in Hopper's pictures invites the viewer to speculate about how these moments came to be and what the imagined human actors pictured therein will do next. Like Hopper, noir directors and cinematographers use costume, shadow, and silhouette in the service of broader compositional schemes and psychological narratives, including the cultivation of a mysterious mood. The dramatic lighting one typically associates with noir was in part an attempt to more effectively communicate emotional expression and the mysterious mood of the story, often through the presentation of flat planes of blackness, thereby rendering space illegible and inciting the viewer's imagination. Hopper's pictures similarly exploited the power of costume, color, composition, and silhouette to evoke particular emotional expressions and moods, much like the shots of noir cinematographers. And meanwhile, the unrealistic, though not total flatness of the clothes in Hopper's paintings also emphasizes another oddity that is thrown into relief by their comparison with images of clothing from film noir, their lack of texture. Just as Hopper's representations of clothes are not truly flat, monochrome blocks of color, but rather just flatter than might be realistic, they are also not completely textureless, but simply less textural than would seem lifelike. By contrast, in noirs, quote, as one scholar said, quote, contrast between brilliant white and jet black, along with reflective fabrics, emphasize the surface and tactility of clothing. The noir's success was built on the newly powerful sensuality of colorless texture and motion in which American dreams were now being acted out. Looking at Hopper's pictures alongside film stills makes the difference apparent. Consider a comparison between Conference at Night and a still from the Maltese Falcon that we're looking at. In the painting, it's almost impossible to differentiate on a purely textural level between the silk of a tie, the cotton of a dress shirt, the wool of a suit, or the felt of a fedora. The female figure's dress is even more inscrutable. By contrast, the many folds and small shadows that the camera captures in the Maltese Falcon, such as the folds in the vest and arms of the suit worn by the man on the right, or the cloth bunching around the woman's shoulder, help us identify these fabrics far more readily. Perhaps most noticeably, Hopper persistently fails to capture the wooliness of many 1930s and 40s suits. While Hopper's depictions of suits look sleek, quite often the suits of this period were made of a thicker and or looser blend, a textural difference that the camera readily captures. Hopper's representations were not always completely devoid of textural clues. For example, we can differentiate between what appears to be a red-orange cotton dress in room in New York on the left and a shinier red silk dress in hotel lobby. But more often than not, when it is possible at all, it is contextual rather than visual evidence that helps us interpret the textures of fabrics pictured in his work. Ultimately, a comparison between Hopper's pictures and film noir reveals significant commonalities, but also differences that underscore the artifice of his painted images. Hopper's trademark aesthetic was, after all, far from realistic. As an artist more focused on mood, psychology, composition, and color than on capturing the minute details of real-life objects, Hopper fashioned fictive worlds that include just enough detail to prove convincing and ultimately immersive. Had Hopper incorporated the dots, stripes, plaids, bows, frills, and other patterns and accessories popular in 1930s and 40s New York into his work, or brightened and varied his fashion color palette, it seems doubtful that his representations of clothing and the people that wear it would have communicated their message about the psychological trials of modern urban life nearly as effectively, or meshed as successfully with his compositional aims. Although the people, quote-unquote people, of course they're fictional people, in Hopper's paintings are imaginary urbanites rather than real ones, his visual representations of clothes paint a picture of an urban landscape in which clothes are, rather than an important means of individual self-expression, instead a sign of adherence to normalcy, a capitulation to the threat of becoming lost in the city crowd. Nonetheless, Hopper's representations of clothes did not render them entirely uncommunicative. In fact, given the inherent social communicativeness of fashion, to do so would have been virtually impossible. Really, Hopper's intent appears not to be to neutralize the possibility of social signification that the realm of fashion offers, but instead to embrace them. After all, Hopper's decision to clothe his figures in garments that send only faint social messages is a choice that sends a message of its own. To dress figures in such clothes is to ask the viewer to imagine that these fictive protagonists' senses of individuality or potential for social connection are severely restricted. These representations of clothes signal Hopper's own interest in capturing and communicating the fundamental loneliness of modern urban life, and play a significant role in the wider set of pictorial strategies that helped his art become identified with themes like solitude and emotional alienation during his own lifetime, and that continue to propel interest in his work's focus on those themes today. By conveying these ideas through simplified representations of 30s and 40s urban clothing, rather than denying fashion's potency as a mode of social communication or a means of conveying an intensely personal and psychological artistic vision, Hopper instead affirmed it. Thank you. And I'm very happy to answer any questions anybody might have. Yes, gentleman in the back.
You make an extraordinarily compelling argument, thank you, for the multiple significations of color. What do you make of a couple of very compelling pictures by Hopper? I think they're always of Jo, where she's not clothed at all.
Yeah, well, they're kind of shocking to look at because it seems indecent to have his nude model. I mean, there are a lot of nude models in art history, but in this case, it's his wife, which is not so normal. So I think in some ways it speaks to the radicality of his sort of willingness to stretch the bounds of normalcy in the pursuit of his the goals of his artistic practice. I think that it's one thing that's sort of strange is that he and his wife lived a very sort of conventional upper middle class social life, but they were also social radicals in some respects. And they were willing to be open in conversation about their sexuality or about sexuality in general. And so it's interesting to think about the way that he represented his wife. They had a sort of troubled relationship at times. And so to extend the metaphor that I'm sort of arguing for in this paper, in some sense, by picturing her naked, he's denying her the sense of self-expressiveness or self-expression as well. Now, there are other sort of messages that are being conveyed through his sort of open sexualization of picturing someone nude. So I don't know that I have enough sort of insight into the strange complexities of their relationship to really say like exactly what I think he was really trying to do. There's possibility that it's sort of intended to be an antagonistic move, but certainly she was very used to being his model in whatever, she often controlled maybe huge swaths of their life together outside of his artistic practice, but she went along with what he wanted largely when it came to being a model for his pictures. So I'm sure that that was something that happened at his instigation.
But there's still, there's still something very intriguing if we don't know that Joe was his model. Then we have a nude.
Mm-hmm.
Sexualized, yes, but also, as you pointed out, even more isolated than if she were clothed, right?
Yeah, I agree. And I think that in a way, a strange thing, and I don't know if this is something he would have intended necessarily, but a strange thing is that the anonymity of this figure is undermined by the fact that now we know that it was his wife and not just some everyday model. So perhaps, I think it is plausible to think that it was his intention for this figure, these nude figures to be anonymous or generic in the same way that when Joe posed for many of the, people in the pictures we've been looking at today, they weren't intended to be representations of Joe. She was just a really convenient female model. So I don't know that I have a very good answer for you about that. I think it's a little bit hard to say because that seems to like thematize the sort of psychology of their relationship in a way that's hard to untangle because of the unconventionality of their relationship. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Did he sketch before he started to paint? And if so, did he sketch totally in charcoal or black and white? Did he ever specify what color he was going to use for a garment? Or did he ever sketch the garment, say, or the table or the drapes in that particular color?
Yeah, so he was very fastidious about his preparation for pictures. And normally that preparation was in black and white, but with notation about what color he intended to include. And so the sort of network of color relationships that I was just describing in the case of many of these pictures was extremely intentional and thought out. And so when he would make black and white sketches, it would normally be sort of a way of working out the composition. And then he was imagining what the colors would be as part of that. Any other questions? Rahima?
Hi. I was kind of struck just a moment ago when you said that he and his wife lived this very kind of unconventional lifestyle. But in his depiction of women, there's a conventionality that he kind of reifies. I'm curious to know, like, when you're talking about their lifestyle, he made a very deliberate choice to then sort of make women as these ornaments, as you kind of alluded to in your paper.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really curious about those choices of doing that, knowing that he was living a lifestyle that was not quite like what he was depicting. Yeah,
I think he and his wife were often at odds with one another, in part because he wanted to, I don't know, maybe have her. I think that this in some ways characterized a lot of like mid-century American marriages, where there is a sort of sense on the wife's part that she wanted to, I don't know, break free from gender norms. And there was an expectation and even a social pressure on the man that he maintain those gender norms. So that was a big part of the sort of strife between the two of them. So I think that in a lot of his pictures, we see his interest in like sort of investigating the psychology of these gendered social roles. But in his own life, he didn't have as much control over how things worked out as he could in his pictures. So he had certain desires for, the sort of life that he and his wife wanted to lead. And at times his wife was more independent than he wanted, and that led to strife between them. So one of my takeaways from all this sort of investigation of Hopper and gender roles and fashion is, probably that Hopper was not what we would think of as a model husband by today's standards, and that he was, there was some misogyny that was maybe in some ways sort of characteristic of its time, but also very particular to him, that is percolating into his work. I think that was a key aspect of his relationship with his wife as well. But she was no, wilting wallflower. She was often, fighting with him with words or not with words over, the character of their relationship, what they were going to do, the extent to which he was going to be the dominant figure in their world. It was a very complex relationship.
The last thing I want to ask about is you mentioned that his wife had quite a bit of clothing herself, but it's such a range to think about their lifestyle as upper middle class, but shopping at like Sears and Roebuck's, but also being able to shop at Bergdorf Goodman. So I'm curious about that sort of juxtaposition. Was it just like, okay, I'm wanting work clothes versus dress clothes?
Yeah. So I think that, their financial fortunes changed dramatically. And what I want to emphasize is really that they lived an upper middle class lifestyle that they could not always afford. And they tried to maintain that facade, as I suppose many people often do. So also I think, another reality is that sometimes, just because you can shop at Bergdorf Goodman doesn't mean you will all the time. Like maybe that's something you can only afford to do occasionally, or maybe also you realize that not all clothes need to be of the finest quality, and Sears is okay for some things, So I think that is part of the explanation, but maybe the main part of the explanation is that they had vastly differing amounts of money because of the volatility of working as a professional artist. And that's why sometimes he worked as a commercial illustrator at times and went back to that because, at times his career as an oil painter went up and down. So. Emiliano.
Thank you. I'm curious about what his early style was before he achieved this artistic maturity and such a particular style of painting. Was it shockingly different, or was it?
I don't know that it was shockingly different. It's maybe part of what's different is that he represented a more diverse set of subjects. So he wasn't always painting pictures of urban loneliness like exclusively as a younger artist. And that was in keeping with the fact that he was an artist in training for a lot of the time. And also was an artist trying to make a living soon after his training was ended. So he had to work on commission to do different kinds of advertisements and that kind of thing. And so he had a wider spectrum of like types of subjects that he represented earlier in his career. And we saw a couple of those with those scenes from Paris. And you can see connections with some of the later work and some of that earlier work, both because if you look closely, sometimes you can tell that like maybe this is the same guy who made these just stylistically. But also like, he was interested in fashion and like city life even when he was still a student artist. And that's not what he did all the time, but that's what he did, or he, chose to do that some of the time. And eventually he sort of moved towards those themes as he gained more independence and moved away from being a commercial illustrator. Yes?
I was kind of struck by the drawing of the woman sewing that you showed
Mhm.
in the collection here, and I was curious to know, that's more of like a domestic sphere, but still showing women's labor in a certain form, but then also women in a more traditional workplace. Like, do his drawings often convey domestic spheres as well, and do you see differences in the way the dress is depicted between those two things?
Yeah, so I will say that he probably had more of a diversity of subjects when it came to his drawings, or this is a print actually. So he was more likely to represent things that were maybe connected to some of these same themes, but not exactly the same kind of thing as, maybe you think about it the same way I do. As I look at so many of the big oil canvases that he made, there are a lot of similarities between them. And I think that a picture like this one is a little bit different, a little bit more personal and psychological, and a little bit less, I don't know, about dramatizing like interpersonal relationships because it's only showing one person. But I do think that there's some real similarity here between like this picture or this print and some of the other interior scenes that we looked at, like, let's see, this one, or this one. Like there's this idea of like looking through the window into like people's personal lives was something that he sometimes did. And one thing that's interesting about this one to me is that it almost implies like a series of relationships, even though it only pictures one person, right? We were thinking about like, who is she? I mean, one thing I think about, and maybe my perspective is skewed, but I'm thinking about why is she looking out the window? What is she thinking about? What's going on in her life? And also, who is she sewing for? Like, what is her role? You know, she's probably living with other people or existing within a family. And so I think that there are similarities here, but this one does seem, I don't know, a little bit, maybe more curious about like who this person is and like what's going on in her life, maybe a little bit more empathetic than some of the others seem sort of cold and impersonal by comparison. And I think that in part, that may be a reflection of the fact that this is slightly earlier than most of the other pictures that we looked at. So he moved more towards the sort of colder style as time went on. Yes?
So one of the things about movies from that era is they do use a lot of things like pattern and color to indicate, I think, a lot of like class information. Do you feel like that's also kind of stripped away in his representations? In contrast to like a lot of the noir films?
Yeah, I think that there is some sense of class differentiation in some of his, like, I don't know, a very obvious example is like, we can tell who is working for whom based on the clothes in this image, right? The man behind the counter is wearing a uniform that shows that he works at this diner, right? So there are instances in which like it would seem strange if the man behind the counter was wearing a suit, I guess I could say, right? So sometimes this sneaks in, but I do think that in general, there is a slight suppression of this, you know, sort of opportunity to differentiate between the social class of people that might exist in real life. Because, for example, it's hard to tell about the quality of the men's suits that, you know, to tell between a Sears and Roebuck suit and a, you know, high-end department store suit when so many of the details of the suits have sort of been left out, or like their texture or the quality of the fabric isn't something that you can readily tell from looking at his pictures. So I do think that there is some sort of suppression of the visibility of these class differences in some of his pictures, but sometimes you can still tell through the clothes. Yes?
It strikes me as odd. This is presumably late at night. Would these men still be wearing full suits that late at night?
I think that many men would. It can feel strange, I think, to think about wearing a suit just around as, you know, while you go, I don't know, run errands or just conduct your everyday business. But I do think that that's something that many men did in the 1940s. It strikes me that these men seem very buttoned up. You know, they're still wearing their tie, they're still wearing their hat. And to me, that helps to almost encourage the sort of mysteriousness or feeling of unease that there's something slightly amiss with this scene. Like something dramatic is about to happen, and these men seem very prepared for it. And I think that's part of what animates people's interest in this scene, this sense of like dramatic potential. Any other questions? Well, oh, yeah, go ahead.
Looking at this one, it looks like the woman was dressed up to go out. They went out and she's got to look at disappointment. They ended up at a diner. Is that kind of what he was going for with that, or?
You know, I think one of the things that's exciting about this picture to so many people is that there are like a million different sort of stories you can imagine that connect not just to like, I don't know, all four of them, but to them individually, especially to the relationship between the couple that are sitting next to each other, you know. And I think what you said sounds plausible, right? They're at this diner very late at night, probably after doing something else.
It's like he's paying no attention to her, but the other two guys are.
Yeah, there's a tension clearly between the couple, right? They look kind of upset with one another. And ultimately, it's irresolvable. Like we have no answer about like what this, is supposed to be about. And maybe, Hopper didn't even have a specific thing in mind, but he was interested in portraying this sense of tension through them. And it allows our imaginations to run free from there. Well, I'll just say thank you all so much for coming and listening to me and your thoughtful questions. I appreciate it. And if you're one of my students, come up here and I'll check you off my list that you were here. Thank you.